I thought I was days away from marrying the love of my life, until a late-night noise complaint led to a shocking discovery. What I saw on that camera shattered everything I believed in, setting off a chain of events I never could have imagined. I could never have anticipated how drastically my life would unravel. My parents, always reserved with their affection, raised me on principles of loyalty and perseverance. I carried those lessons with me, working relentlessly through long nights of study and countless sacrifices. Growing up in a modest suburb of Sydney, I earned every success through hard work and determination, eventually landing a prestigious position at one of the city's top private banks by the time I turned 29. Relationships had always taken a back seat to my career, late hour at the office, constant networking events, and a focus on personal achievement left little time for romance. That all changed the night I met Georgia. It was at a gala event hosted by the bank, and she was like a spark of life in an otherwise formal setting. Outgoing, carefree, and effortlessly charming, everything I wasn't. I hesitated at first, unsure if someone like her would fit into my carefully organized world, but Georgia had a warmth that quickly broke down my walls. Before long, we were inseparable. Our relationship grew quickly, and soon the topic of marriage came into view. Georgia had been raised in a deeply traditional family, and her parents were initially wary of me. But after seeing the stability of my career and my reputation, they gradually came to trust me. Moving in together was a big step for both of us, a calculated risk that showed our shared commitment to the future. I began to picture an idyllic life ahead, meticulously planning a wedding that would symbolize the beginning of a lifetime together. But things didn't stay perfect for long. As the wedding approached, I noticed subtle cracks appearing in the foundation of our relationship. One red flag I couldn't entirely shake was Georgia's increasingly close friendship with my groomsman, Tom. I convinced myself I was overthinking it. After all, trust is the backbone of any healthy partnership, right? I kept telling myself that doubt would only poison what we were building. Tom and I had been friends since our university days. He had a natural charisma and humor that made him magnetic to others, the kind of friend everyone wanted by their side. I had never doubted his loyalty. Then there was Carl, another groomsman who had only joined our circle more recently. Outgoing and impulsive, Carl was known for making questionable decisions but was still well-liked. The cracks became harder to ignore as we planned my bachelor party. In the days leading up to it, I remained oblivious to the storm that was brewing. I didn't realize that I was about to learn the hardest lesson of my life in the most excruciating way possible. Resting on a bed at a friend's house that night, I had no idea that everything I thought I knew was about to be shattered. I was lying on the bed, scrolling through my phone without much thought, until I decided to check the surveillance feed from my apartment. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. But then I heard it, creaks, muffled groans, and other unsettling sounds from the bedroom. I froze, every nerve on edge. Slowly, the truth began to dawn on me. Georgia was there, and she wasn't alone. Tom and Carl, my best man and groomsman, men who had just been celebrating with me earlier, were with her. I couldn't comprehend it at first. The memories of our trip to the Gold Coast flashed through my mind, the horse races, a wild night at the casino, and a relaxed Sunday by the pool. Tom and Carl had cut the trip short, claiming they had urgent work to handle. Shortly after their sudden departure, hotel staff found a bag of pills in the room, leading to a tense confrontation with security. Even with a lawyer friend trying to smooth things over, we were evicted and forced to sleep at the airport before catching a late flight home. After all that chaos, I was completely drained. But my other groomsmen were insistent that the party wasn't over. "Come on, Adam, it's still your weekend. Let's go to Tony's place," they urged. I didn't have the energy for it, but I reluctantly agreed, not wanting to dampen the mood. Georgia was out with her friends, so I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. It had only been 2 months since she moved in with me after her lease ended. Her traditional Catholic parents weren't thrilled about it, but they tolerated the arrangement because they respected my career. At Tony's place, things quickly fizzled out. Within half an hour, most of the guys were passed out. Exhausted, I decided to find a bedroom to sleep in. Just as I was about to doze off, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my downstairs neighbor: "Get some rest, idiot. Some of us have work tomorrow." I laughed, assuming he sent it to the wrong person, and replied jokingly. But then a second message came through that made my stomach twist: "Exactly. Just take her off and go to bed, or shut her up. You must be really good to be texting while your fiancé is moaning so loud." I sat up, my mind racing. What was he talking about? He thought I was someone else, but the message couldn't be ignored. I stared at my phone, frozen in confusion and disbelief. Could it be possible that he was talking about Georgia, with them? My chest tightened. I scrambled to check the camera feed, ensuring it was recording. The footage wasn't clear, grainy due to poor cloud coverage, but it was enough. I could make out figures. Georgia appeared briefly, leaving the room, and Tom and Carl followed her into the kitchen for drinks. I strained to listen, catching fragments of their conversation. Tom mentioned Georgia's wedding dress, laughing about some kind of plan they had for the reception. Georgia's voice was casual, disturbingly unaffected, as if everything happening was normal. The neighbor wasn't done messaging me. "They've been at it for a while, man. Thought you might want to know." I felt trapped in a waking nightmare. My best friend. My groomsman. My fiancé. I had trusted all of them, and now I was left staring at the wreckage of my life in real time. I forced myself to act, though my mind was screaming in chaos. I called the police, my voice shaking as I tried to explain. "Please, I need someone to check on my apartment," I pleaded. The dispatcher asked for more details. I told her about the noises, the footage, the neighbor's complaint. But even as I spoke, a cold sense of disbelief gripped me. How had it come to this? How could the people closest to me, people I loved and trusted, betray me so completely? Every second of waiting for help felt like an eternity. I kept watching the footage, unable to look away from the betrayal unfolding before my eyes. I decided to play up my panic, pretending I had no clue what was causing the noise since I wasn't home. The dispatcher listened as I feigned confusion, and after a couple of minutes, she transferred me to a detective. Detective Sergeant Potts, from the Vice Crimes Unit. "How can I help?" a calm but authoritative voice said. "I'm scared for my fiancée, please, I need someone to check on her right away," I replied, keeping up the act. Within minutes, 2 officers arrived at my apartment, tools drawn as they signaled to each other. Moments later, 4 more officers followed, making their way toward the bedroom. I quickly switched back to the surveillance feed. Tom and Carl were still oblivious to the police, too caught up in their reckless behavior. Then, the situation exploded. "Armed police. Get on the floor now," an officer bellowed. Tom and Carl froze in shock. Carl tried to resist, but an officer swiftly kicked his legs out from under him. Tom, on the other hand, stayed close to Georgia, not moving until another officer grabbed him by the hair and forced him down onto the floor. "You're safe now," I heard an officer say softly to Georgia. "The paramedics will be here soon." Georgia mumbled something, barely audible. I watched with a mixture of anger and apprehension, wondering what story she would give. Would she play the victim or admit the truth? Either way, the facts would eventually surface. My nerves were fraying, but I forced myself to stay focused and switched the camera feed to Tom and Carl. There they were, sitting silently in their underwear as a plainclothes officer interrogated them. "We found a stash of pills in the apartment," the officer said sternly. "This could classify as illegal substances, and you're already over the personal use limit. You're facing serious charges." My mind raced. How would this unfold? Would they try to spin a story? Would Georgia back them up or turn against them? I had no choice but to wait. Later, at the hospital, a constable met me in the lobby and led me to a private room. Detective Sergeant Potts was already there, speaking on the phone. He hung up as I walked in and approached me with a steady expression. "Mr. Spencer," he greeted, offering his hand. "Where's my fiancée?" I asked, my voice tight with anxiety. "She's with the doctor." "You'll see her soon," Potts replied, guiding me to a seat. "But before that, I need to ask you a few questions." I nodded, trying to keep my composure. "Let's start with tonight," he said, leaning forward. "When did your neighbor first contact you about the noise?" I pulled out my phone. "It was around 11:45 p.m., I answered, scrolling to find the message timestamp. Potts took out his phone and showed me a series of photos. "Do you recognize these men?" I hesitated, unsettled by the pictures. They showed Tom and Carl, but they didn't fit the usual criminal profile. They looked like typical office guys. "Is this normal?" I asked cautiously. "Just a hunch," Potts said. "They don't match our typical suspects for these situations." Feigning surprise, I narrowed my eyes. "What is this? Why are you showing me pictures of Tom and Carl? You know them?" Potts asked, his tone sharpening. "Yes," I said, my heart pounding. "Tom's my best man, and Carl's a friend." "What's going on?" Potts didn't immediately respond, his gaze lingering as if assessing whether I was hiding anything. I braced myself for the rest of the questions, knowing this night was far from over. "The men don't seem like the usual threat," I said cautiously. "But with the stash of pills they found, it's enough to keep them overnight." The officer standing next to Potts nodded and added, "Yeah, we can hold them for now." Potts turned to her. "What about the fiancé?" "He's acting pretty shaken," she replied. "But something feels off, almost like he's playing the part of the shocked victim a bit too well." Potts frowned. "All right, how do you want to handle this?" "We should have a word with Georgia before she signs anything," she suggested. "Warn her about the penalties for perjury. She might crack if we put some pressure on her. We could scare her a little to get useful information, but we need to tread carefully. One wrong move and we could get sued." Potts snorted lightly. "Guess that'll end up in the 'Guess Who Don't Sue' column, huh?" he joked, referencing a notorious local gossip section. "Come on, Potts," the officer chuckled, "you're such a geek. Now spill, what's the deal with these guys?" Potts sighed. "It's Tom and Carl, the best man and a groomsman." Eric, a junior officer who had been listening in, let out a whistle of surprise. "Wait, what? They were involved? Who'd they target?" I interjected bitterly, "Take a wild guess, my fiancé. Or maybe I should say ex-fiancé." Eric fell silent for a moment. "Man. I didn't know anything about this." "Of course you didn't," I muttered, feeling the bitterness rise again. Later, back at the hospital, I tried to appear composed as I wrapped my arms around Georgia. "It's okay. You're safe now," I murmured, even though my mind was spinning with plans on what to do next. The officers handed me their business cards, and I left with Georgia in tow. During the drive home, she kept praising me, her words cloying and desperate. "You're so wonderful. I love you so much," she gushed repeatedly. Back at the apartment, I tried to distract myself by cleaning up the mess. Georgia, however, seemed determined to pull me closer, pressing her body against me. "Come on, baby," she whispered, tugging at my shirt. "Hold me. I need you right now." But I couldn't. Not after everything I had witnessed. I kept my distance, mentally noting that I'd get tested later, just to be safe. Georgia pouted, but I wouldn't give in. At around 3 a.m., still too restless to sleep, I decided to call Sergeant Potts. It was time to lay my cards on the table. He might have been suspicious earlier, but I needed to show him I had nothing to hide. The line clicked after a few rings. "Staff Sergeant Potts," he answered, his tone clipped and tired. "Hey, It's Adam Spencer. We met earlier at the hospital, I said. Sorry if I woke you. No, I'm on the night shift, he replied curtly. What do you need? I've got CCTV footage from my apartment. It might help clarify some things. I tried to sound both urgent and cooperative. His tone sharpened. Why didn't you mention this earlier? What's on the footage? Betrayal, I said bitterly. You'll have to see it for yourself. Potts paused before continuing, all right. There's a cafe near Surrey Hills, close to the Oxford Tavern. You know it? Yeah, I confirmed. Good. Stay away from the more obvious spots. There are too many cops hanging around those areas, he warned. Got it. I'll meet you there at 8 a.m. I hung up, but sleep still eluded me. I tossed and turned all night, the images from the camera replaying endlessly in my mind. By 7 a.m., I finally dragged myself out of bed, showered, and glanced at Georgia. She was still lying there, pretending to sleep, probably crafting her version of events. At 7:30, I caught a segment on the morning news, but I couldn't focus. I had bigger things to handle. I grabbed my phone and dialed Jack, one of my close friends. Can't explain over the phone, Jack, I said in a calm but firm tone when he answered. This about the newspaper, he asked quietly. I'll fill you in when we meet. Can you come to the city? All right. When and where? How about that bakery near your old office, the one with the great cakes, I suggested, trying to keep things casual despite the storm brewing inside me. Got it. See you around 11, Jack replied before hanging up. I sighed heavily. The clock kept ticking toward confrontation and inevitable fallout. Sounds good. We'll see you there, but Adam, please, don't make any final decisions just yet. Get all the facts first, Jack advised cautiously. I already know enough, I replied, my voice heavy with finality. I'm sorry, Jack. Meanwhile, Sergeant Potts filled me in. The first two, Tom and Carl, have their bail hearing tomorrow. Tony might make an appearance, depending on how things go with the prosecutor. It's a public hearing? I asked, hoping to get some clarity. Yep, Potts chuckled. The lawyers pushed for a private session, but the prosecutor wants everything out in the open. He flipped open a copy of the Morning Herald, landing on the CBD section. I played dumb. Not sure I follow. Potts smirked knowingly. Your CCTV footage. You have remote access, right? With a time map? Yeah, I can pull it up, I said casually. Good. Let's make sure we cover everything, he replied as we wrapped up the conversation. Later that morning, I made my way to the company's main office. As I stepped into the building, I bumped into a secretary, who pretended to lose balance, nudging a postman's shins in the process. Hey, Adam. How was your weekend? She asked awkwardly. Watch it, the postman grumbled, rubbing his leg. He exited at the next floor, leaving an uncomfortable silence in the elevator. I said nothing, eyes focused ahead, while the others suddenly found the floor very interesting. When I reached the top floor, I headed straight to Turnbull's office. The secretary barely glanced up from her desk but gestured for me to wait. A moment later, she rose, knocked on his door, and stepped inside. Within a minute, I was called in. Turnbull, the CEO, looked up from his desk, already sensing something serious. Adam, what's going on? I took a steadying breath and launched into the story. I called the police last night after a noise complaint. When they arrived, they found pills in my apartment. Georgia was tied to the bed, while Tom and Carl were involved with her. I paused, pulling out a handkerchief and theatrically dabbing my eyes, though no real tears came. Turnbull leaned forward, shock spreading across his face. Oh God. Go on. They initially thought it might be a coercion case, I explained, my voice low and somber. But after questioning, that was ruled out. Now, Tom, Carl, and Tony are all being held on charges related to the pills. Turnbull paled visibly. This is a disaster, for the company and for everyone involved. It's bad all around, I said grimly. There's no easy way out of this mess. Later, I met Jack at a quiet bakery near his old office. I knew the moment of truth was at hand. He sipped his coffee nervously while I lowered my voice to explain. Last night, the police responded to a noise complaint, I began. They found Georgia in bed, with my best man and groomsman. Jack froze, trying to mask his shock. His face paled as I continued. At first, they thought it was coercion, but that wasn't the case. Stop, Jack cut in, his face flushed with both disbelief and fury. This is ridiculous. My daughter would never do something like that. I'm sorry, Jack, but the photos don't lie, I said softly. He stood suddenly, his voice rising. The wedding is off. That's it. That's not going to help right now, I countered, trying to keep him from spiraling. Jack slowly sat back down, visibly deflating. I could see the weight of the situation settling on him. He pulled out his phone and turned it over as if trying to distance himself from the reality of it all. I don't believe this, he whispered hoarsely. In that moment, I knew he understood there was no denying the truth. He wasn't just mourning his daughter's actions, he was mourning the trust that had been shattered between families. I'm sorry, Jack, I repeated, knowing words alone wouldn't be enough to ease his devastation. You should have known, I said quietly to Jack, my voice thick with disappointment. I hope you don't lose too much in deposits, but it looks like you might. You and Janice don't deserve this, but I can't go through with the wedding. Jack wiped his eyes and nodded silently, his pride and spirit visibly wounded. Have you told her yet? No, I replied. She was still asleep when I left this morning. I had a meeting with the detective right after. God, Adam, Jack muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. Later that day, I learned something that fueled my simmering rage. Jeff, one of the groomsmen, had been sent by Carl and Tom's lawyers to speak with Georgia. They were afraid she might say something that could worsen their case. Jeff had been trying to minimize damage, but in doing so, he was about to ruin his engagement with Penny, a woman from one of Australia's wealthiest families. Penny's family owned billion-dollar iron ore mines, and Jeff's career was hanging by a thread. This was poetic justice unfolding, though I had little sympathy. My own life was in shambles, and now so would his. When I finally returned home, Georgia wasn't there. The delay gave me more time to prepare the video evidence for Penny, revenge set into motion. When Georgia did return, she wasn't alone. Shelley, one of her closest friends, was with her. Their expressions darkened when I confronted them. What's Jeff doing visiting you this morning? I asked sharply. Shelley froze, clearly caught off guard. Georgia stepped back like she'd been struck, her eyes darting nervously between us. You're on your own now, Shelley hissed suddenly, turning on Georgia. I can't believe you dragged me into this mess. She shoved Georgia aside and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Georgia crumpled to the floor, sobbing. Between gasps, she muttered, I'm sorry. None of this would have happened if you had just stayed with me this morning. Why does it all have to fall apart? I crossed my arms, leaning against the wall as I watched her. She looked so small and helpless, but I felt no sympathy. My mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Perhaps I could offer the detective leverage, a promise to drop any perjury charge if Georgia gave me the full truth. But I wasn't even sure she knew the truth herself. After a long pause, I walked over and helped her to her feet. I guided her to the kitchen table, keeping my distance. She reached for me, trying to snuggle close, but I stepped back coldly. I grabbed 2 beers from the fridge, cracked one open, and slid the other across the table to her. We're done, I said flatly, taking a slow sip. My voice carried a finality that left no room for negotiation. Georgia looked stunned. "Fine," she muttered, her gaze falling to the floor as tears welled again. We sat in tense silence for a few moments until she finally spoke, her voice bitter and trembling. "You think you're perfect, Adam, but you don't understand what it's like. I had to survive, to prove myself." Her tone hardened as she continued. "You're the golden boy. Youngest to hit a 7-figure bonus. Meanwhile, I've had 3 jobs in the last 2 years just trying to stay afloat." "And what?" I said, leaning in, my voice icy. "Sleeping with your boss to get ahead? That's not exactly the best way to build a reputation." "You wouldn't understand," she snapped, her anger bubbling to the surface. "You have everything handed to you, respect from day one. I had to claw my way through, and sometimes you have to do things you regret." "That's not an excuse," I replied coldly. "We all make choices. And now you're facing the consequences of yours." Georgia glared at me but said nothing more. The distance between us, both literal and emotional, felt insurmountable. Whatever we once had was now beyond repair. "I did it. I landed 3 major accounts," Georgia said, her tone defensive as though the end justified the means. "Doesn't matter now," I replied coolly. "They won't even let you near the system." She bit her lip, frustration simmering beneath the surface. Finally, she grabbed her keys and threw them on the table. Without another word, she stormed into the office. I followed, standing silently at the doorway as she tried to access the bank's computer system. She kept glancing nervously at the screen, tapping away like she knew what she was doing. "I can access it remotely," she said, forcing confidence into her voice. But after several failed login attempts, she slumped back in the chair, defeated. "They blocked me," she muttered, sinking deeper into her seat. But after a moment of thought, she suddenly straightened. "Wait, there's a backdoor to Jeremy's computer. I stored video files there for emergencies." "All right. Let's see it," I replied, the tension in my shoulders easing slightly. After a few more minutes of hacking around, she made progress. I pulled out my phone and called Eve, an old tech contact of mine. He answered after the second ring. "Thought you forgot about me, man," he joked, his voice lazy. "It's 6:05 p.m., I said flatly, not in the mood for small talk. "Oh. What's going on?" Eve asked, sensing the seriousness. "Don't press charges against her," I muttered, dodging the real issue for now. "She's got enough to handle." Eve's tone shifted instantly. "You know anyone in anti-fraud?" he asked, intrigued. "Maybe," I replied vaguely. "I'll let you know." I hung up without elaborating and called Georgia's father next, asking him to come pick her up. While waiting for him, I sent the damning video of Georgia and Jeff to Penny, his fiancée. Revenge didn't feel as satisfying as I'd imagined, but it was a necessary step. Not long after, 2 men approached my apartment, a man in a security uniform and another in a suit holding papers. "Mr. Adam Spencer?" the suited man asked, his tone stiff. "Yes," I replied, suspicion rising. "I'm from the bank's legal department," he said bluntly. "Your contract has been terminated under Section 112. You've embarrassed the bank, and you're dismissed." The words hit me like a slap. "Wait, what? I signed a new contract just 3 weeks ago." I protested. "I don't know anything about that," he said coldly, handing me a severance check and a small box containing my personal belongings. Without another word, they turned and left. I stood there in stunned silence for a moment before snapping out of it and shouting after them, "Wait." But they didn't stop. The next morning, I braced myself for a confrontation with Turnbull, the CEO. I knew he'd be in the executive dining room around noon, so I timed my arrival to catch him. On the way, I checked Eric's latest article, which mentioned high-profile bankers but notably left out any details about Penny or Jeff. How Eric had gotten that scoop without all the details, I couldn't be sure, but it was clear there were people keeping the full story under wraps. At 1 p.m., I stood outside the bank, waiting for the lawyer I had contacted to arrive. He showed up late, holding a court order. The magistrates took their time, he said, handing the paperwork to me. Inside, a guard stopped me at the entrance. "Sorry, Mr. Spencer. You're no longer allowed in," he said firmly. "I have a court order," I replied, holding up the papers. The guard hesitated but didn't budge. Turnbull entered a few moments later, his face darkening when he saw me. "What's this about?" he asked in a clipped tone. "Call Jeremy. He'll explain," I said coldly. Turnbull didn't flinch. He pocketed the papers and walked past me as though I were invisible. The guard grabbed my arm and began dragging me toward the exit. "You've got 24 hours to fix this," I shouted after Turnbull as the door slammed shut behind me. Once outside, I stood still for a moment, trying to calm the anger boiling inside me. Everything was crumbling around me, my career, my trust, my relationships. But I wasn't done fighting yet. The guard kept a tight grip on my arm as he marched me outside. I clutched my golf clubs tightly, refusing to look back until we were out of the building. Just as I pulled away, he muttered under his breath, "Parasite." "Sorry, my lawyer's waiting," I replied, oddly satisfied by his frustration. He scowled but didn't push the issue further. The rest of the day passed quietly until I received a text message from someone asking for updates on my legal situation. "Anything else fun?" the message read, dripping with sarcasm. "Nope," I responded, smiling to myself as I imagined Turnbull fuming behind closed doors. I didn't have to wait long for more drama. Later that afternoon, Turnbull himself appeared, storming toward me with a look of pure rage. "You'll never work in this city again," he growled, his voice low and threatening. I met his glare with calm indifference. "Why stop there? Let's make it nationwide," I shot back coolly. His face twisted with fury. "Never again, you little fool," he hissed. "It's been a pleasure doing business with you," I said, laughing as he stormed off. Despite his threats, I still had leverage, emails between Turnbull and Jeremy, which painted a damning picture of their fraudulent activities. Once the funds cleared, I planned to forward the evidence to the anti-fraud department. When the fraud investigators reviewed the emails, they confirmed my suspicions. "This looks like a full-blown fraud operation," one of the agents admitted. But then came the inevitable question. "How did you get these emails?" a detective asked, his voice tense with suspicion. I didn't flinch. "They weren't obtained legally," I confessed bluntly. The detectives exchanged frustrated looks. "We know these big shots are dirty," one muttered, shaking his head. "But they've got layers of legal protection. We can't just drag them in and make them talk." The securities agent, however, was more laid back about it. He saw potential in the evidence, especially once other testimonies started stacking up. In the lead-up to Turnbull's fraud trial, Tom and Carl were brought in as witnesses despite their pill trafficking charges. Their testimony linked Turnbull to Jeremy's long-term schemes, and the case gained traction. On the first day of the trial, Turnbull walked in looking calm and confident, flanked by a team of high-powered attorneys. But by the end of the session, the cracks started to show. His tie was loosened, sweat glistened on his forehead, and he looked visibly shaken. The prosecution was relentless. The judge eventually ruled there was enough evidence to proceed with a full trial. Faced with mounting pressure, Turnbull changed his plea to guilty and was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. While it would have been satisfying to see him lose everything, I knew better. White-collar criminals like him rarely end up destitute. Just before the indictment, Turnbull had quietly moved most of his assets to offshore accounts. After the dust settled, I found myself struggling to regain my footing. Trust issues lingered, making it hard to move forward. Eventually, I decided to channel my energy into something restorative. I began working on a wetlands restoration project 700 kilometers west of Sydney, near the Darling River. 2 mining companies and a bank, eager to improve their public image, were funding the effort. I'll be staying in an old homestead that was once part of a large sheep station. The vast open spaces, endless sky, and fresh outback air might just be what I need to find peace and rebuild my life. With luck, maybe some good fortune will finally come my way.